Yeshua was educated by the Essenes and reached a very high state of spiritual development during the 30 years in which he used his body. It may here be said parenthetically that the Essenes were a Thite sect which existed in Palestine besides the two mentioned in the New Testament, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Essenes were an exceedingly devout order, widely different from the materialistic Sadducees and entirely opposite to echiti, hypocritical, publicity-seeking Pharisees. They shunned all mention of themselves and their methods of study and worship. To the latter peculiarity is due the fact that almost nothing is known of them and that they are not mentioned in the New Testament. A group of particularly pious priests, elders, and laymen are the outstanding group who form the Essene sect. They considered themselves the righteous remnant of the Zadokite priesthood. They break away from the Hellenized and corrupted Zadokites, known to us as the Sadducees. Three main groups of Essene take form: the Nazarenes, the Oseans, and the Enochians. The Enochian adherent believed there would be an end time and everyone must be prepared. The Nazarenes and the Oseans held a similar belief. The idea of a designated group, including those who join them, is indicated or stated throughout the Book of Enoch. The Enochians believed a Messiah would be needed to administer the final teachings of the law and the prophets. Enoch chapters 38-40. The first is the merciful, the patient, the holy Michael, 40.8. The Enochian scriptural emphasis would be the Book of Enoch, but otherwise very little is known about them. However, the text of Enoch became a continued influence within the Hebrew Bible and probably has much to do with the Enochian sect's viability. Also, the Book of Enoch is represented in the New Testament. Revelations 1.13-14 references the Ancient of Days. His head and his hairs were like wool, as white as snow, with Enoch's 4.6.1-3, whose head was like white wool. Enoch 4.8.2-5, in that hour the Son of Man invoked before the Lord of Spirits, and his name in the presence of the Ancient of Days. Before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of heaven were formed, his name was invoked. Compared with John 1.1-2, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. Both scriptures would lead one to believe that the disciple John must have had familiarity with Enochic beliefs. The above scriptures require time, acceptance, refinement, and a continued and organized effort to form this extended theology. This would infer the Enochic vision as ongoing, a root of Judaism almost from the beginning, perhaps as early as the times of Enoch himself. What later is designated as the Zadokite priesthood is thought to have its roots in the earlier formal priesthood, beginning with Aaron, Moses' brother. Later, the traditions observed within the books of Samuel indicate a true prophet led by the Spirit, for it is he who designates David. But earlier traditions show evidence as well, most prominently Melchizedek, the king of Salem, a priest-king. Also, brothers of the righteous are mentioned in Enoch, also indicating much earlier priesthoods. Isaiah 9.6, c. 725 BC, is another good example of the continuation of messianic theology. For unto us a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This gives attribution to the longer-standing messianic vision, which is very much in line with Enochian and Essenic thinking generally. All Essene would consider themselves the sons of Zadok, or Zadokites. The priests are the converts of Israel who departed from the land of Judah, and those of the Levitical priesthood who joined them. The sons of Zadok are the elect of Israel, the men called by name who shall stand at the end of days. From the Damascus document, the four Dead Sea Scrolls, also taken from Ezekiel 4.4.15-17. The sons of Zadok were considered the most knowledgeable of the Zadokite priesthood, and these should not be confused with the Sadducees, those who controlled the temple. Oseans, ossuary, Nazarenes, Nazarah, sprout or branch. The Qumran Essenes are known as the Oseans. The establishment of Qumran, is believed to have originated in 150 BC. The later separation within the body of the Essene will represent two groups: those whose bent became more legalist and secretive, Oseans, and those whose teachings remained uncluttered by the legalistic approach, and who are later described as mystic, spiritual, or enlightened, Nazarenes. Although both groups would share a respect for the law, it becomes clear that the Nazarene heritage of understanding moves toward a more omnibus spiritual base and eventually will include all men. As Yeshua will demonstrate, the spirit of the law is more important than the written law itself. Early members of the Yeshua faction were usually referred to as Nazareans, or those who practice in the way. Many varied denominations would have visited Qumran, in part due to the availability of manuscripts. Essenes would consider themselves the holiest of the Zadokite priesthood. They maintained strict adherence to Mosaic law, but also created other laws, in an attempt to make one even more holy, as one might do within a discipline or priestly training. And their practice of the law under the authority of the sons of Aaron, who have freely pledged themselves to restore his covenant and heed all the precepts commanded by him to be practiced by the multitude of Israel, who have freely pledged themselves to return in common. They shall be inscribed in the order one after another, each according to his understanding and his deeds in the law. From IQSV 21 Zik 7 DSS translation Giza Verms. Sabbath laws were added in due time and became extensive, from not dealing with commerce, to not cooking, to not drawing water, to not eat from the fields, such as fruit, to not carrying a child. In other words, all was to be prepared beforehand in preparation for the Sabbath, and these rules were strictly applied. The priests themselves had a penchant for using the mikveh often, and this is noted by many. Yeshua the Nazarene would condemn these new laws in Matt 15.1-15, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. One could view the Essene denomination as looking back to the original Aaronic priesthood. Their vision was to secure a lost past, hidden and safe with them, but turning even so in on itself. Laws upon laws, the complexity wandered into every part of life. The Essenes too knew the time for Messiah was near, and was one reason for the original bitter separation from the corrupted Zadokites, later Sadducees, in the first place. They would wait for Messiah and believed someone must prepare for him, but they, like the Pharisees, believed they would assume the mantle of righteousness. The separation ascends with the teacher of righteousness who led the Essene into northern Israel, but finally lands on John the Baptist and Yeshua. Both of their influences pointed to the future. For John, he preaches absolution, forgiveness, and the resultant return to righteousness. For Yeshua, making whole the lame in spirit and in flesh, and preaching a purer form of unity and an expansive understanding of the Spirit. He is the righteousness. Not ascribing spiritual guilt under the law, but understanding that the sin itself is suffering enough. Forgiveness stands above the law. The gulf of comprehension between the two different Essene groups is overwhelming. Essenes are generally identified with lawyers and scribes. They would maintain what is known today as the scribal authority. Many Essenes did have a deeper knowledge of mystic truth. The problem is they interpreted from a legalistic approach, and they seem not to want to share with the people the more intricate or secret knowledge they had assumed. The teaching within the synagogue followed a prescription. In contrast, Yeshua would teach metaphysical truth, of which sowing the good seed is one. Love prospers new growth and harmony, while revenge does not, is another. And spiritual light brought into a room, mind, reveals all things. The core of Yeshua teachings is metaphysical, often related to a more mystical pathway. So above spirit, so below earth might describe Yeshua message, or the spirit brought down to the earth. The transference of the spirit into the physical, even that the kingdom is within, bodes a powerful reality the legalists could not grasp. The law, and only the law, might describe the position of the scribal authority. One must remember that the original separation was due to the temple priests' corruption and Hellenistic syncretism. Certainly they would believe that the return to the basics, especially for priestly training, would reside in formalism and the formal study and application of the law. Since Ezra, the scribes had continued to gain influence and were later taken as the highest authority within Judaism. And just as certainly they would believe they should lead the way back from syncretism into holiness and purity. Essene =scribes/lawyers. Kegel Companion Bible. The Qumran priests and scribes considered their main task to copy or multiply scriptures. Scribes would be very well versed in the law, and the lawyers themselves would be higher-ranking priests who would provide later commentary or interpretation within the sect itself. It is within this legal formalism the scribal authority emerges, later developing into a legitimate sect, scribes. designated as the Osean Qumran Essene. The formalism of Ezra's Second Temple legal sway contends with what would later become the Nazarene theology. Yeshua chastises Pharisees and lawyers. The more extreme legalism would flow from the Osean, including non-scriptural cleansing practices. Thus, Pharisees would be much more closely associated with the legalist Osean Essene, and who created many purity laws themselves. Within biblical scripture, Pharisees and scribes are found together. Yeshua, as a Nazarene, would be forced to contend with both. Qumran itself may have had members from many different splinter groups visit its scrolls. Texts of various kinds have been discovered in the caves of Qumran. Yeshua almost certainly visited Qumran, but this has never been confirmed. Most scholars believe John the Baptist did. He was raised in the Qumran tradition, but probably spent more time near En-Gedi, nearer his place of birth. This odd mixture of strict adherence to legalism is far from me. Scribes and Pharisees, 15.1, are referred to in these scriptures. The impetus toward righteousness through rules, rather than an emphasis on revelation, seems a shared understanding with all of the Qumran attendees present. Heart understanding, as opposed to a legal dissertation, seems the intent here. The arrival of Messiah would be the expectation for all Essene. However, the order of events within the Osean pathway had become sullied and stifled. There seems very little support for Yeshua from any of the priestly community, although later it is noted that some Pharisee priests did favor Yeshua but were afraid to speak up. John 1, 2.3, 2-33. The suppression of Yeshua came from the top down and was almost complete. How many priests from Qumran rallied to Yeshua's side? We do not know. We do know that many of the scribes stood against Yeshua. Acts 4.4-7, 14-18, okay, 2.2.2, and the chief priests and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Lelke 22.66-67, completes the journey with, and as soon as it was day, the elders of the people and the chief priests and the scribes came together and led him into the council, saying, 67, Art thou the Christ? Tell us. They feared the people might convert. The Qumran Essenes shared one common view with all Essene, that Essene priests were the proper temple authority and would eventually assume authority within the temple. As a faction of the original Zadokite priesthood, they did have a rightful claim. In agreement with Yeshua, they neither would continue animal sacrifice in the temple, John 2.16-17. This cleanliness and rules version of holiness versus a more natural or everyday life became a serious issue, whether it is phylacteries on robes or wiping the cup and whispering a prayer to consecrate the deed. Yeshua was accused numerous times of not obeying various purity laws. In fact, Sabbath law he largely dismissed. He healed on the Sabbath of all things. Use of wine pretty much kills the idea that Yeshua was, or at least remained, a Nazarite. See, Nazarite John. Many of the elderly came to Qumran because their time was short and sanctity would be high on the list of their accomplishments. The burial sites near Qumran contain hundreds of men, but hundreds of women also at a separate nearby site. This would indicate celibacy for both men and women, at least at this location. Set in their ways and the firmness of the law, they generally removed themselves from society. Legalism increased, nor would they accept immersion from John the Baptist, essentially to convert to the new revelation, and for that reason would be left out of God's plan. Luke 7.30 *. Luke 7.30. But the Pharisees and lawyers rejected the counsel of God against themselves, being not baptized of him, J. the Baptist. The love principle Yeshua teaches accentuates the inner man, spirit man, and thus thrusts the man before God instead of first judging the man by the law. This transition will require a whole new spiritual order, inferring a new standard for humanity as well as a more humane treatment under the law. By contrast, one might say the Qumran Essene became intellectual legalists, as opposed to interpreting the spirit of the law as Yeshua did. All Essene would view themselves as sons of light, keepers of the light of truth. Later, the continuation of this theme in the New Testament, as in, but was sent to bear witness to that light. That was the true light which gives light to every man. Jat. A 1.8-9. All lead to the basic Essenic vision of Messiah, who is the light of God, shining forth in purity and righteousness, which in their view should not be denied by or to any Jew. True light, which gives light to every man, denotes that not only would Messiah reveal God in a manner not yet known to the Jews, meaning the true light, but in doing so would become evident to others outside Judaism with the meaning of every man. Those who could not recognize Messiah, those who thought otherwise, would therefore become usurpers of one kind or another. The spirit of man is the candle of the Lord, searching all the inward parts of the belly. The community, as it is written, established its group around strictness in obedience to the law. As mentioned, they would become the lawyers who would write the commentaries, an effort to provide what they considered deeper clarity. By contrast, Nazarenes would interpret law much as Yeshua did, by the nature of enlightened understanding, or by the effusion of the Spirit of God, but shall impart true knowledge and righteous judgment to those who have chosen the way unto God. That would be the intent of both divisions of Essene, by the Nazarenes at the arrival of Messiah and the new revelation that would set men free, essentially what we know today as the good news, and by the Essenes through more purity laws and strictness to the law, although Messiah would be welcomed. Is it righteous to do good on the Sabbath, Matt 12.10-14, or is it more important to obey the law? This is perhaps the best biblical example of the two differing mentalities. The Essene view pronounced legalism combined with purity rituals as the core of the Judaic Reformation. Nazarene Essenes interpreted the theology of the way in a much more mystical tradition. A useful example of this more mystical understanding is the use of the term Son of Man, 22.66-71. Son of Man is understood as a proper name and a soul of heavenly origin, literally a divine anointed one who had not yet been revealed. The Son of Man would embrace the greater enlightenment of grace, Noah, as preeminent, as Yeshua teaches, and would give the final interpretation of the law and the prophets, the final teaching of the way. Yeshua would leave the law subjugated to forgiveness and mercy. For this and other reasons, Yashua is observed to have had Nazarene Essene roots. He would personify the Essenic messianic vision for man, both in his teaching and in his person, rather than a continued or expanded vision for the law. Asterisk 67. If you are the Christ, tell us. But he, Yeshua, said to them, if I tell you, you will by no means believe. 68. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. 69. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. 70. Then they all said, are you then the Son of God, interchangeable with Son of Man? And he said to them, you rightly say that I am. The far northern location of the Nazarenes is important. Here toward the end of the 1st century AD, we have members of the family of Yashua residing at places significantly called Nazara, Sproutville, and Kochaba, Starville, not far from the Greek cities of the Decapolis. If we accept the statement of Epiphanius that Kochaba was in Batanea, then we should look for Nazara in the same district. The Secret Legacy of Yeshua, quoting Schoenfield, Chap. 7, Rochester, Vermont, Inner Traditions. In line with the above description, many scholars now believe the lost years of Yeshua were spent in retreat locations, preparing for what would become his ministry work. It is almost certainly true that Yeshua traveled, perhaps extensively, as this was a part of the priestly discipline. He may well have traveled to Damascus, much closer to the Horon region in grey of Nazara and Kochaba than Jerusalem. That Saul later has letters of arrest to prosecute in Damascus tells us much about the widespread influence of the Nazarenes and the teaching called the Way. Yeshua may have visited Qumran as well, for Yeshua seems more than a little bit knowledgeable concerning the legalist Osseans. Other foreign journeys may have included India and possibly northward into the Caspian. Alexandria and the southern reaches of the Nile, Elephantine, were known places of visitation and study. The Enlightenment teaching of the Way would sound strange to those unfamiliar with Nazarene thinking. The Enochian and Nazarene Essenes held more visionary and mystical views, especially that a Messiah was necessary, not just arriving. It was believed that man could not sort the evils of this world, which only a heaven-sent being may do. As for the Sadducees, they did not see a need for Messiah, as they thought the Torah was complete and that man needed only to adhere to it. In light of this difference, the scribal authority, lawyers and scribes, and the priestly authority, Sadducees and Pharisees, battered Yeshua with philosophical and legal questions, attempting to entrap him, and thus either expose him to the Romans as a rabble-rouser, else turn the people against him if possible. However, many ordinary citizens of the Essene sect and some of the Pharisee adherents did convert and believed Yeshua to be the Messiah. Nicodemus, a ranking Pharisee and member of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, would be the most prominent example. Sabbath law and practice had evolved in the previous 2 centuries, but not for the better. The disagreement with Yeshua's interpretation of the Sabbath law became a concern. Sabbath observation, observing sanctity within this new legalism, soon becomes the conflict. Yeshua presents a much more compassionate and revelatory view of life and the Sabbath, yet at the same time practical. Yeshua believed healing on the Sabbath was holy. Legalists believed carrying 2 figs was work and not allowed. Revelatory, sometimes mystical but practical, describes the nature of the way. Sowing seed is practical, speaking the word is direct, and prayer is a mainstay. The fact that most of the Qumran Essene priests did not recognize their own Messiah leaves them in the legalistic basket with the Pharisees. Most scholars agree that many of Yeshua's Galilean followers came from the Essene community. Later, more Pharisaic followers would have joined the ranks. No one could deny what they saw as healing and miracles became evident. To give one example of the expanding ministry, palm trees had never grown in Jerusalem, thus palm fronds laid before Yeshua at the eastern gate had to come from Jericho. This effort would require organization and a knowledgeable commitment to assemble such a welcome. Even so, for his perceived blasphemies, the Essene scribes and lawyers continued a dark outlook on Yeshua. Near the end of Yeshua's ministry, at least some of the Essene priesthood were vehemently against Yeshua and are thought to have played a role in pressing for his crucifixion.